Okay, so my name's Chris. I work at Airbnb. I've been at Airbnb for like 2.5 years. And for the last year, I've been working on, we have a team in China. I've been working for that team to do research on these stories, which is a feature that we have in China. It's only in China right now. And what I'm going to talk about are 3 questions that we answered through research, user research, to ultimately facilitate personal growth. These are the 3 questions. I'm immediately going to skip that, though, because I want to introduce you to Hong and Xin, 2 travelers that came to San Francisco over Chinese New Year, which was like the end of January. So this is them at Fisherman's Wharf. They went to Pier 39. They went to Fisherman's Wharf. They went to Lombard Street, which, like side note, is called, in Chinese, it's called Flower Street, because this is what it looks like when it looks really cool, but when they went, it was like fall, it was like winter, so there were no flowers. And so a lot of Chinese tourists go there, and they're super disappointed because it's called Flower Street, but it's just like dead plant street. Anyway, after they did that, then they drove down Highway 1, Pacific Coast Highway, to Los Angeles. So this is what they did. They came to California. They stayed in Airbnb, which is how I knew what they were doing. And they did these things, and it's like a very conventional itinerary for anybody that comes to San Francisco, but especially people from China. They tend to go to especially Fisherman's Wharf and Lombard Street for some reason. So anyway, this very conventional trip, how do we take that conventional trip that everybody takes and make it interesting? Or how do we help Hong and Xin, the 2 travelers, how do we help them make it interesting? Because this is a very conventional itinerary that in and of itself is not interesting. So that's like the ultimate question that we're trying to solve. But I'll take a step back and dig into the problem. So what does interesting even mean? When I say, how do we make their trip interesting, what does it mean? The first question that we researched was, what kind of stories do people like? What is interesting? So like over a year ago in January, we went to China and we started to do research. We started with focus groups where we had, this is one group doing an exercise where they're like cutting up magazines and sort of designing their ultimate travel story, like what would be the best travel story. And from that, we got like this big list of topics, like things that people want to read about, like food, shopping, cross-cultural understanding, heartwarming tales, I don't know, just a big list of topics. And that was great, but that in and of itself wasn't very helpful because we could have just written a bunch of stories about these topics, and it would have felt very sort of insincere because we were just it would have just been like a very superficial thing. So we wanted to understand why these topics were compelling, to really to dig deep into like what people find compelling. So we did contextual inquiry. So this is a van we drove around in. We went to Shanghai and Chengdu, went into people's homes, and just talked to them for like 2 hours about their last trip, their first trip, whatever it was about travel that excited them, that made them, influence them, that was meaningful to them about travel. This is a picture in a person's home. The person you can see is the moderator. The person whose face is cut off is the person we interviewed. So this is what we did. We went and talked and learned, like in this case, she's showing us like pictures from her trip and all that stuff. And we were just trying to gather stories to see what people started to talk about. This person was super interesting because she was 19, and when we talked to her, she had just gone to Sweden for like 6 months as like an exchange student. And she had this crazy story where she was staying with a host family in Sweden. There was a 14-year-old daughter, and they had this like intense discussion about human rights and like civil liberties, which is sort of taboo for Chinese people to even talk about. But the Swedish 14-year-old was like adamant, and they had this like very like intense discussion. But it left a huge impression on this particular traveler, and this is what she said about it. She said, "When I came back to China, I thought about what I should do or what I should improve. In the past, I only watched the domestic news, but now I pay attention to international affairs as well. You should not only pay attention to your own country, that's vertical. We need to be horizontal." That was like a translated quote too, so it must have been really cool in Chinese, but so eloquent. But I thought that was so interesting, and that was sort of an extreme example of someone who really had like a transformational experience when traveling, but not super uncommon. There were a lot of people that had very like meaningful experiences when traveling, And that was like sort of a big eye-opener, because we had this sort of insight that the things that people care about when they travel, what travel means to people, is like related to the content that they consume while they're planning to travel, the stories that they want to read. So there's like an interesting relationship there between the needs that are being met through travel and the stories that people want to read, which led to this, what I call a hierarchy of travel meaning, where there's different like layers of meaning. So like different things that people take out of a trip. On the bottom is seeing, which is very like superficial. You might see a really good view or like a beautiful building, something that you would just like take a picture of and like move on. And some people, they'll see a temple in Thailand, and that's great. They take a picture and they move on. Other people will go to this temple and the same temple and have a totally different experience. They may be totally moved. Maybe it's a religious experience. Maybe they're really introspective about the architecture. So these are all the different like levels of meaning that we heard from people that we talked to that they took away from travel. And at the top is growing or transformation, anything like that. So that story from that woman that went to Sweden, she's definitely in that top part of the pyramid. So this first question, what type of stories do people like, is answered in a sort of abstract way. People like stories that are rooted in a type of meaning that mirrors what they want to get out of travel, which is sort of like a non-answer, but helped us understand that we needed to create stories that were not just about like where to shop in Tokyo or like the best food in Seoul. It needed to be like grounded in something that was very like authentic and true. So about a year ago, we launched the first draft of these stories. These are just some screenshots from the stories. And they went pretty well. They actually increased bookings for people that were exposed to them, which is like a nice bonus. We didn't even think that would happen. But the cool part is that they're out there in the world. The downside is that they're very manual. They're manually created, like written by editors or even professional writers. So it's not scalable, and two, it's not like. Remember earlier there was that talk about, on one hand there's like the consumer, and on the other end is like the community. This is very much consumery, right? Because it's like written by professional writers and consumed by the users of Airbnb, but there's no like community sort of value creation in it. And so we wanted to move beyond that. We wanted to get an MVP out to sort of prove that it was interesting. But once we did that, the next question then was, okay, cool, how do we make it so regular travelers can do this? And can they even do that? Can regular travelers like write compelling stories? Is that even a thing? So we did more research, went back to China. In this case, we went to Shanghai and Wuhan, and we did a huge batch of research. We did a diary study where we actually sent people prompts to take pictures and write little blurbs while they were on their trip. Then we followed that up with interviews. We did focus groups. This was a big thing. In both Shanghai and Wuhan. And I had to include this picture in here. This is like a random mall in Wuhan, and it's just because we're in Denmark. Veromoda, right? This Danish chain. But not only was it Veromoda, which is really popular in China, but this Nordic by nature thing. I've never seen that anywhere else. I just thought that was cool. Random Danish thing. Okay, so anyway, so we did these. So remember that hierarchy of like meaning that came from the first batch of research. We thought, okay, that seems like there's something there. So we're going to ask people prompts that are like grounded in those different levels of meaning. The actual prompts aren't that important, but we thought if we ask people like things that are about growing or about feeling or about seeing, then we're going to get like really good, we'll just get great stuff and it's going to be awesome. And we did get some good stuff. Like we got some people were just good photographers, so we got like good pictures. We got some good stories, but it was very like chunked up, and it wasn't like a cohesive narrative. Like people would say, like, I found this cool street art on the streets of Bangkok, and da-da-da, but okay, cool, but that's not like a story. You can't really make a whole story out of that. So these isolated chunks of information, or even worse, okay, so here's a shot. The participants sort of blurred out, the moderators in the foreground. And this woman is telling a story about her first trip to Singapore, how this was like 10 years ago, she didn't know any English, she only spoke Chinese, but she was told that it's not a problem in Singapore because there's plenty of people that speak Chinese, you can just go and show up, it'll be totally fine. So she goes to Singapore, she's like, her first outbound trip outside of China, trying to figure out where to go. She's in the city. It's starting to get dark. This isn't her picture, this is just random picture of Singapore. But you can imagine the vibe. So it's sort of getting dark. She's in an unfamiliar place, and she's trying to find people that speak Chinese because she was told it's like super easy. But she can't find anybody that speaks Chinese. She finds like some kids that speak Chinese, but they can't help. She's really starting to freak out, and it's getting dark, and she doesn't know how to get to her hotel. Luckily, she finds an elderly guy who speaks Chinese, but he speaks Cantonese, and she speaks Mandarin. But they make it work. They like sort of struggle through it. He tells her, "Oh, you got to get on this bus." He even writes it out for her, like go to this stop and then walk here, and like turn-by-turn directions from his head. And then he even when the bus comes, he walks her on the bus. He tells the bus driver where she has to go to make sure that she gets off. He totally takes care of her. So as she's telling this story, it's this very emotional experience. It was 10 years ago, but she's still crying now because it was this elderly guy made such an impression on her. And this is a very meaningful, moving story to her, something that I think she'll never forget. So then when we asked her at the end of her description of the story, we said, "Have you ever written about that story?" Because she had written other travel stories online. And she's like, "No, I never wrote about it." And then the moderator said, "Well, what would you write about if you were to write about it?" And she's like, "Well, I would write about how to take the bus in Singapore." And she's got this awesome story that brings her to tears 10 years after the fact, but she doesn't even realize that that's what the goal is. Instead, she's like, okay, yeah, it's helpful to know she learned how to take the bus. People could benefit from that, but that's not going to resonate. No one's going to want to read that. Which led us to the second conclusion, that without help, people often fail to realize how interesting their own stories can be. She's thinking oh, I got to help people take the bus, but really, and maybe she was a little embarrassed about it, but we heard other people sort of have these stories that they just didn't think were worth telling. Okay. So that brings us to the third question. So we can't just give people prompts and get great stories. It's a little harder than that. So how can we do that? How can we up-level people's stories and get the best versions of their stories out of their heads? So we did one more round of research, this time in San Francisco, where we intercepted shadowed people from China traveling in San Francisco during Chinese New Year. We talked to 5 different travelers, or groups of travelers, and we just followed them around as they went through the city. And we thought we're gonna go all out. We got a professional photographer, which is the guy on the right there, and we're gonna get awesome imagery. We're gonna interview them while they're doing cool stuff in this great city, and surely we'll get good stories from that. So back to Hong and Shin, the people with this very conventional itinerary. This is them at Fisherman's Wharf. And this is, again, their itinerary. So it's this very, almost cliche trip to San Francisco. And where we followed them was probably the most cliche part of that trip, Fisherman's Wharf and Lombard Street, the most touristy things you can do in San Francisco. So again, this is them. And one thing we noticed, sort of before we even talked to them, was that they were very lovey-dovey, flirty, but in a cute way, and it was just, okay, that's weird, cool. I didn't really know what to make of it. They were doing things like this, super cute. And it's oh, this is interesting. So then when we walked from Fisherman's Wharf to Lombard Street, it was a 15-minute walk, and I was talking to Shin, the woman, and just asking her, oh, how long have you guys been married? And she looks at me, she's 2 days. And I'm like, oh, you must, maybe you said the wrong word, 2 days? And she's like, yeah, 2 days. I'm like, what? You just got married? And she's like, yeah, we just got married in Minneapolis. I'm like, what? What's going on? And then she goes and she tells me the whole story. So Shin is a graduate student at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. Hong is in Beijing. And they've been together for 7 years. But now suddenly, in the last couple months, they've been having this long-distance relationship. They talk via WeChat every day. They do these video chats, so they're trying to maintain it, but of course, it's challenging. And then at one point in November, which is the time of Thanksgiving in the U.S., which sort of probably brings up a lot of anxieties about relationships and all that stuff, Shin decides to send a postcard to Hong. And she writes to him about how excited she is about Thanksgiving, her first Thanksgiving, and how she misses him and she wishes she can see him and stuff like that. And then it's blurred out for privacy reasons, but in the upper right corner, it's like almost like an afterthought. She writes da-da-da-da-da-da, which, and I don't even know how to say this, but this is what it was. But what it means is, will you marry me? She wrote him a postcard in November, and it took a month to get, that's pretty iffy that mail's even gonna get delivered. And it took a month from the time she sent the postcard to when he got it. But, so she proposed to him via postcard. And when he got it, he went on WeChat and did a video call, said, yes, I marry you. And that was in November. Then, so fast forward to January of this year, Hong and Shin's mom fly from Beijing to Minneapolis, which is where Shin is studying. And it's this is probably what it looked like. It's very cold at that time in Minneapolis. And they're only there for a couple days, but they decide to get married. And they have 2 days. So they go through the whole list of judges. There's one judge that can marry them. So they go to the courthouse. I can't show any pictures of that, but they go to the courthouse in Minneapolis. They get married, I don't know, just regular old people just going to Minneapolis to get married. And then, a day later, they're in San Francisco, essentially on their honeymoon. And so that's when we talk to them. And what's crazy is if you look at Hong's WeChat feed, if you look at it, you might sort of put the pieces together, looks like there was a wedding at some point, but it's not a very compelling narrative. In fact, we showed people, with Hong's permission, his straight WeChat feed. We showed it to people and said, what do you think about this story? And people were like, I can't really follow it, it's very boring, I'm not going to read it. But then we showed them version 2 of his story, which was with this whole postcard proposal, long distance relationship thing in there, and it was much more interesting, right? Because it wasn't just this dry thing about we went to Fisherman's Wharf and Lombard Street and we took pictures and da-da-da. It was oh, we fell in love and we got married and we eloped. That made it much more interesting. And so this is a quote, another Scandinavian reference by Joe Nesbo. How do you say it? Is it Nesbo or is it Nesbo? Huh? Oh, yo? Whoa, that's hard. That's not even... All right, cool. I thought he was Danish because he had the but I guess he's Norwegian. Anyway, but it's a good quote, which is, I'm going to read over here. So you've got to make the story interesting besides it just being a plot. That's why character matters, why you've got to make the characters interesting. I've heard other, Martin Scorsese has a little bit about this. I heard it on a podcast by Seth Rogen, of all people. But basically, the idea is that the plot is what happens, but the story is why it happens. The story, the characters, whatever. So in the case of Hong and Shin, when they were in San Francisco, the plot is that conventional itinerary, which is nothing. It's just boring. But the story, in this case, is their relationship, which is actually really interesting. And much more, when you add that layer to the narrative of their trip, it takes it from something that is super cliche to something that's very original and sort of surprising. So that led to this framework of story and plot. There's sort of both ends. So you think of the whole thing as a narrative. Part of it is a story, part of it's a plot. Basically, the more of each thing you have, the better. More plot, more story equals better. So you can have something that's a lot of plot, doing action stuff where they're I don't know, going on a mountain biking adventure, and you don't really need to have a lot of story. Or you can have something where they barely do anything, but there's a lot of interesting relationship stuff, and that makes it interesting as well. So to sort of conclude on this point, how can we help people tell their own stories better? We have to help them think beyond just the plot, which is the obvious thing. There's a couple websites in China where people will write detailed records of their trip, but they're often very dry, informative things like how to take the bus in Singapore, and they don't even think of this whole other layer of interest, and that's what sort of the next version of these stories that we're going to come out with is going to deal with, is how do we add that layer of story to what would otherwise just be a standard plot. Okay, so to tie this back to personal growth, because when I described this to Hala, I was on this personal growth thing, yeah, it's going to be all about personal growth, and then I realized I had to tie it back into personal growth. But I actually think it works cool. So I really like pyramid-based frameworks. This is Maslow's hierarchy, right? Like, so hopefully you guys have all seen this. But at the top is self-actualization or maybe transformation, which is, you might say, is growth. And so for people that are consuming content, like reading an article, or if it's video, watching a video, the growth can come via inspiration. So you might read about, say you read about Hong and Shin going to San Francisco. And because it's like this interesting narrative layered in with this relationship, you might think, oh, that's really cool. Like, maybe I should do something crazy with my wife or with my girlfriend or something like that, which could inspire you to have a richer trip rather than just like a go to the place and check off all the boxes. So we're thinking that we can, like for the people that consume this content, we can inspire them to have like richer, more fulfilling trips. Likewise, for the people that create the content, we think we can help them grow through reflection, which is the same idea, but just sort of retrospectively, where after you take a trip, you might not realize just how interesting it was until you go back and reflect on it. And it's something we found in the diary study that we did, which is that we didn't have the prompts perfect, but when they worked, they actually worked really well in getting people to think like one layer beneath what was immediately obvious to them, and they would realize like, oh, this actually was sort of cool. I didn't even realize this is how they recycle in Japan. Like, that's actually sort of a neat thing. And so by giving people that sort of suggesting that they reflect, we think we can help them get further up this Maslow hierarchy. That's all I have. So I think there's a lot of time for questions.
Yeah.
Hopefully you have some.
Lena, there's several over here, yeah. Great.
Yeah?
Microphone's coming. Yeah. Your teacher.
I have been working a lot with storytelling and has a background ages ago in film script writing.
Yeah.
So, and everybody knows when a story is boring or when a story is missing elements, but not everybody can tell a story.
Right.
So how do you plan to actually teach people to be able to tell a story?
Yeah. I mean, that's like the hard part. So I think, like, we're not to the point where we, like, have, like, algorithmicized storytelling. Like, we're at the point now where we're, like, it's sort of, like, if on one end of the spectrum is, like, completely, like, professionally written articles, and the other end, the opposite of that, like, like, everybody writes amazing stories. Like, we're trying to get more to the middle, which is, like, trying to get people to reflect on their trips, and think about the relationships and more than just the itinerary, but then ultimately, like, sort of combing through the stuff we get and using professional writers or editors to either put it together themselves or work, like, do a feedback loop back to the travelers and help them, you know, like, work together and, like, sort of co-create the story. Because you're right, like, it's like you can't just, like, give people good prompts and suddenly everybody writes good stories. Like, we're just hoping that we can, like, extract some of the great, like, stories that are out there, because there's got to be, like, thousands of them that go, just like that woman in Singapore, that go unreported. So, like, in that case, if we had a prompt for, like, when was the time you felt vulnerable or afraid, she might just barely mention that. But then we could sort of recognize that and say, oh, could you tell me more about that? And then through a feedback loop, sort of develop what could be an interesting story. So.
So I thought you were going to talk about this whole creating experience on Airbnb, and I just want to know if, like, what you're talking about is somehow connected, or if like you are working on connected in somehow.
Mm-hmm. You mean like you can book an experience?
Exactly.
Like
I thought this was something like, okay, you did the user research, and now then you did the book the experience. But then, what happened?
Yeah. So. Yeah, it's like internal Airbnb politics. But so, like, the short answer is that, like, stories or experiences are like English only for now. This is hard for people in China. But I think the long term, what we're thinking long term is that it sort of comes back to this idea that like part of the idea behind experiences is that, like, actually the way it's sort of presented in the big rollout video was they took a traveler to San Francisco who had a very conventional trip and like up-leveled his actual trip, not just the story behind the trip. And I think what the experiences are doing are moving people like rightward on this. They're adding more action and like better action for some people to the trip. So instead of doing like the touristy things, they're doing things that are sort of inherently more interesting because it's more rightward on the plot thing. So like long term, I think what would be great is to have people that go on those experiences to give us elements from their experiences on those experiences, and that could probably create even better stories, stuff that's like all the way over to the right on that x-axis. So probably we will incorporate that. We're just not there yet.
Two quick questions.
Yeah.
One, look, why the focus on China specifically? Was that done deliberately, and then are you looking to roll that out? And the second question was, particularly with the Chinese, they're not particularly known as being gushing sharers, whereas I imagine you could have done this a lot easier with Americans who are much more willing to share. So why? Yeah, I guess why China?
So in China, there's these two websites, Mafengwo and Chanyo, which have like these like incredibly deep sources of user-generated trip stories, which are much more like itinerary-based. But and Airbnb has some partnerships with them, and it's been like a helpful source of traffic. That's one thing. And then we also know that in China, a lot of people come to we do a lot of promotions that bring traffic to the website that don't have anything to do. They're not like looking to book anything. So we've got one, there's this like ecosystem of travel stories that exists in China that's sort of unique. And then we've got all this traffic that doesn't have anything better to do. So the idea is something that probably could be done universally, but the China team just decided that they wanted to do it. So they just took it and ran with it. And that's why we just happened to start in China. It also made like a nice like sort of pilot sort of thing where we weren't subject to all the, the politics of the big headquarters. We could sort of do our own thing. It just made it easier. And then the second question is a really good point. Like, I think what we've seen is that like younger people tend to be more open. This is probably true around the world, but especially in China, I think there's a difference between like people that were born, like the post-90s generation, people that were born after 1990, just seem to be more willing to open up. We had a couple user-generated stories that included like elements of vulnerability where people expressed frustration, and these were stories that were shared on other platforms. But when we showed them to people, they like, super resonated with them because it felt very authentic. So I'm sure you're right that like we could probably get gushier stories easier in like the US or Europe, but yeah, we're sort of stuck. We're already in China, so we just got to do it there.
Anybody else? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's kind of an extension of the others, like why did this whole story concept started? Because you started saying that they took this trip and it was not really interesting. But did you knew that they didn't think it was interesting, or was it just an assumption that because they did what everybody else did, that it was not interesting?
Right, no. Yeah, like, you mean like the whole idea of having these stories on the website? Yeah, like, so, like, artistic license, because it's totally not presented in like chronological order. Like Hong and Shin, which is like real people but fake names, but they just came to San Francisco like in January of this year. But the original research for this started a year ago, so it's just an example to show a point. But why we started this project is because of the rich ecosystem in China for these stories, which I think is partially due to the fact that China has like sort of sheltered internet, right? They don't have Google, they don't have Facebook, Twitter, a lot of like Western websites. So there's sort of like the cultural distance between China and the rest of the world is maybe a little bit bigger. So like maybe that explains why there's like these very successful websites that talk about what it's like to travel elsewhere. I don't know, for some reason there's these really successful websites in China, and we just felt like that was like, if we wanted to sort of be perceived as like a Chinese brand, that's something we had to do. It was just sort of like part of the culture, I guess.
Cool. Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you.